Welcome back to In-Depth Literature. Today we are here for, as promised, why you should read Infinite Jest, the infamous Infinite Jest, or why you should not read it. I think everybody should read it. May or may not be your cup of tea. Now, I do have a lot of notes that we're going to be referring to, so if I'm looking down on and off through this video, please forgive me. There's a lot to sort of contextualize in the universe, not only Infinite Jest, but of David Foster Wallace himself. Himself, no pun intended. There's actually a character from Infinite Jest called Himself. So let's get into it here. And first and foremost, I think the universe of Infinite Jest is divided between aficionados that worship David Foster Wallace, worship Infinite Jest. They never question it. It's the greatest novel of all time, right? And also then on the flip side, you have sort of the detractors that have criticized Infinite Jest and say that it's due to its complexity, therefore it's so complex that it's not worth reading, right? So there's sort of two sides to the Infinite Jest universe, and we'll sort of talk about that. But going further, yes, we're going to discuss some of the plot. We will discuss some of the characters. We will discuss some of the conspiracy surrounding Infinite Jest. We will discuss David Foster Wallace, of course, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to make the decision to pick up Infinite Jest, or at best, at least get a copy of Infinite Jest and at least start to contemplate reading it, because that's kind of what I did. And just for the record, I know there's a lot of other YouTubers that have talked about David Foster Wallace, have done some Infinite Jest analysis. We've got Right Conscious and Benjamin McAvoy and even some older channels, but I promise this video is going to be 10 times better than all of that stuff. So let's get into the world of Infinite Jest. So published in 1996, David Foster Wallace spent quite a few years writing this. I'm not sure if he spent quite as long as he did on The Pale King. But just sort of to get this video going, the original title for Infinite Jest was to be supposedly called A Failed Entertainment, which is kind of a cool title, but it's not as good as Infinite Jest. So that's, that kind of refers to what we were talking about in the last video, a couple videos ago, where it's important to not only get feedback on your editing, on the meat and potatoes of your novel itself, but also some feedback on the title. If the book remained to be called A Failed Entertainment, it's almost like he's saying that this book was a failure. So I think the title Infinite Jest is much stronger. Let me know what you think in the comments section. So the title Infinite Jest is intriguing in itself because of sort of the not only the addictive sort of narrative or the narrative surrounding addiction that takes place in Infinite Jest, but also sort of the way that the novel functions as sort of an addiction in itself in order to understand and complete the novel, right? So not only do we have characters within the universe of Infinite Jest in the actual novel, that are suffering from addiction, but also to actually really understand and finish Infinite Jest sort of becomes like this quasi pseudo sort of addiction in itself. I mean, I talked about the fact the last couple book vlogs, reading updates that we've done, that it's important to be vigilant when you're reading Infinite Jest, because otherwise, if you're only picking it up once or twice a week, you're going to be completely lost. I know a lot of people spend a lot of time reading Infinite Jest. We put in, a little over 4 months, which I think is appropriate. I've heard of people reading it in a shorter period of time. But sort of, it's just kind of interesting the way that the characters are sort of immersed in this world of entertainment and addiction, but also the reader sort of not only is participating in that via the characters, but he's the reader, he or she is sort of also suffering this addiction to completing the mammoth of Infinite Jest. So I thought that would be kind of an interesting sort of juxtaposition just to kind of start the video here. So in sort of the second tier of this video, we're going to sort of talk about sort of the surface level themes. I don't want to talk too much about, the surface level themes like the Organization of North American Nations. I'll just give everybody a quick rundown, but I don't want to stay too focused on the surface level stuff because there's really so much more to cover. But obviously we have the Organization of North American Nation, which is sort of abbreviated as ONAN. That's sort of the society, the geopolitical society that Infinite Jest sort of functions in. And this Organization of North American Nations is comprised of Mexico, United States, Canada, and its leader is known as Johnny Gentle. And the sort of the one detractor, the one rebeller against sort of this Onan oligarchy is Quebec. In particular, is sort of plotting to rebel against the Onan sort of society that these characters are living under, right? So we have sort of this, not only do we have this theme of addiction and depression and trauma and all this kind of stuff, we also have sort of this a vast sort of geopolitical knowledge that David Foster Wallace shares with us. And we'll talk more about some of my suspicions regarding his mastery of geopolitical sort of, topics. We'll talk a little bit more about what his maybe potential connections were to that. So anyway, that's just, that's another, just sort of a little quick background on Infinite Jest, is that it's sort of this dystopian, obviously dystopian sort of worldview. And in addition to this nation, sort of the calendar year and corporate enterprise sort of merge, and that's why we have chapters and sections called Year of the Adult Depend Undergarment or Year of the Whopper or blah blah blahs, because corporate enterprise has their little sticky fingers in every single aspect of society. And of course, sort of the idea of subsidized time. So I have that in my notes too. We have the idea or the propaganda of subsidized time, corporate enterprises controlling the calendar in the society of the Onan society. It's sort of a play on words, referencing not only Onanism, sort of a biblical topic relating to a character that committed, spilling his seed and so on and so forth. So it's sort of a masturbatory reference, not only the Bible, but just sort of this self-seeking, self-pleasuring society that these characters are living under. We've heard so many YouTubers talk about that already, so that's why we're not going to delve too far into that. That's pretty surface level in my opinion. Tell me if you think I'm wrong. But going a little bit further, a significant theme of addiction is explored, not only with addiction itself, but the process of how one becomes an addict and sort of the question of how one reaches sobriety, aka the character of Don Gately comes to mind. You guys will meet him pretty early on in the book of Infinite Jest, maybe a little bit later on. And Don Gately sort of works and his universe functions around the Ennet house, halfway house. So David Foster Wallace sort of demonstrates, and he goes into pretty lengthy detail of what addiction is like, different types of addiction, but also sort of this idea of addiction to treatment itself. We've all heard the old additive of, Alcoholics Anonymous and, Narcotics Anonymous sort of has this cult-like mentality. I'm not saying I believe that necessarily, but it definitely makes sense in sort of the way that David Foster Wallace sort of portrays that, and sort of the way that recovery becomes sort of addiction recovery becomes an extension of another addiction, if you will. So I thought that was sort of important to mention. And I think Wallace sort of debates in this, topic or sort of this ideology of what is the best method to recovery, often casting a critical or skeptical light on organizations like AA or NA. It's fairly clear that David Foster Wallace was a follower of AA or NA at one time. Obviously, from my research, a lot of his interviews, he said that he went to these places to do research, but lo and behold, it's coming out more and more nowadays after his death that he was actually, a member of AA, or he was attending AA at least, and maybe in his mind, yes, that's considered research, but he was going because of his own marijuana and alcohol addiction. And I didn't find any specific, evidence in my research to suggest that he was shooting up or sniffing drugs up his nose or anything. I think he was more of sort of a habitual pot smoker, drinker. I'm sure he did other drugs too, but he wasn't like some druggie living on Skid Row, as far as I know. But he did have several nervous breakdowns throughout his life and career, several unliving attempts, unfortunately, from David Foster Wallace. So it's no doubt that he had knowledge of therapy and addiction recovery therapy, so on and so forth. So sort of the question remains in the universe of Infinite Jest, the topic, or I keep saying topic, the question is asked from author to viewer is the question of, should addicts give themselves up to these almost cult-like groups that often focus too much on sort of active recovery at the expense of every other aspect of their life? And I've seen that, and that's kind of what we see with the crocodiles, that hang out at AA, and David Foster Wallace, kind of jokes about these crocodile characters that are just, their life is fully immersed in AA, and you have to pledge yourself and you have to follow the 12 steps and yada, yada, yada. And he's not the first one to criticize sort of the AI methodology, right? But can one become and remain sober alone, or must they give up their entire life to sort of these cult-like sobriety entrepreneurships and clubs? And so that, I just thought that was kind of interesting. Now, sort of just briefly, let's discuss sort of the narrative structure centers around several characters and plots, the majority of characters being interconnected. And you'll kind of understand what I mean by that later on in this video. But Infinite Jest must be embarked on for the long term because of its length and the ever-evolving and unfolding narrative, worldview, character arcs, family history, etc. And that's kind of, like we've said a couple times in this video, you don't want to spend too much time on Infinite Jest, but yes, it is a tome and it is a commitment. And part of that commitment is immersing yourselves in the universe, the characters. So we've sort of talked about some of sort of the surface level themes. We're going to start getting a little bit deeper here. And get into some other territory. But for an example, sort of referencing what we just said, the Incandenza family, for example, the Incandenza family history is told over hundreds of pages through the perspectives of Hal, Mario, Oren, Avril, and James, aka himself, the father figure of Infinite Jest, or the deceased prior father figure, as well as a myriad of other close associates that sort of ebb and flow into the universe. And I can't really think of any one particular character that is not related in some form, unless they're from a different time period or something. But there are simply just too many characters to cover. But we're going to keep things centralized on the Incandenza family and the main characters that sort of influence the interactions and the character arcs of the Incandenza family. But we also have other important characters that are not part of the Incandenza family, but like we said, interact with the Incandenza family, like Don Gately, for example. So within the Incandenza family dynamic structure, the family is pretty messed up. The sort of the narrative focuses on the trauma that they experience together, the physical, mental, and emotional trauma that takes place, as well as sort of this Freudian-esque tension, mother-son situation that occurs between Hal and Avril, possibly being a reference to Wallace's own complicated relationship with his own mother. David Foster Wallace grew up in a highly academically driven family. His mother was kind of like the king of the nest, so to speak, maybe the one that wore the pants in his parental relationship. And it's speculated that she was often demeaning to David Foster Wallace, even borderline abusive. We have some incestual themes that we discussed as well in the universe of Infinite Jest. So was David Foster Wallace somehow physically or mentally incestually harmed by his real mother? I think that's definitely a topic for debate. Or was it more of just this exploration of trying to defeat the sort of Freudian mother pressure, that sort of a plague that many sons suffer, try to maybe outdo their narcissistically oppressive mother, or just sort of the whole Oedipal Freudian thing in general. Maybe that's kind of what David Foster Wallace was more focusing on. But there's no question that if you've read some stuff on David Foster Wallace, biographies, articles, what have you, that he had a very challenging relationship with his mother and also maybe with his father, but that's not as well explained. Now, before we go a little bit further, we must talk about sort of the sportsmanship aspect of competition that occurs in Infinite Jest, with the primary character being Hal, who is enrolled at the Enfield Tennis Academy with his brothers as well. And this seemingly inspiring place for sportsmanship unfortunately becomes sort of a neurotic hell of competition, repetition, and the pursuit of mastering tennis, alongside the same time Hal, in particular, Hal in Cadenza is suffering with a really bad pot, tobacco, alcohol addiction. He's showing up hungover. He's sneaking off to the basements and the secret hallways of the tennis academy to embark on his quest for marijuana, and we sort of get this sort of dual narrative, very much like what an addiction is and functions as, is this sort of this little thing that is very tempting and you get pleasure from it, but it becomes a terrible distraction and leaves you not only wanting more, but leaves you wanting to get away from it because you know that it's kind of holding you back. Yeah. So we've got Hal and Cadenza suffering from addiction. We've got Don Gately suffering from addiction. We've got all the other characters at the halfway house suffering from addiction. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But diverging briefly from the Incandenza family is also the main character that we discussed prior, named Don Gately, who is a former Demerol addict and supervisor at the Ennet House Drug and Recovery place in Massachusetts, I believe this takes place. Here, Gately assists addicts with mundane things such as filing paperwork, making sure they're following their curfews, but he also scrapes toilets and does a whole myriad of things at the Ennet House Drug and Recovery facility. But moreover, Gately sort of serves and he sort of serves as the book's one of the book's sort of redeeming heroic characters, and he probably arguably obviously has the biggest character arc by the end, at least, even more so than some of the Incandenza cats, right? Another, significant side plot is Hugh Steepley and Moranth, who are located out in the desert of Arizona somewhere, who are sort of acting as covert agents, spying on not only each other, but sort of the family members of the Incandenza family. Oren Incandenza, for example, develops some weird infatuation with Hugh Steepley. And before I go further into Hugh Steepley, he is sort of this cross-dressing, undercover Quebec agent, they call him, and he works for sort of the what's known as the Office of Unspecified Services, I think, and not only does he work for them, but he also works for the rebellion group. What is their name here? We'll get to that later. Oh, the Assassins, Fatuli Roland. I can't speak French, but he works for this French-Canadian wheelchair assassin sort of rebellion group that's covertly spying on not only Onan, but also the Incandenza family. So Steepley works for the Office of Unspecified Services that is seeking to get the master copy of the Infinite Jest movie, which is a whole nother rabbit hole that we will have to get into towards the next part of this video. But the father figure of the Incandenza family, known as James Incandenza or himself, has constructed this mysterious, highly addictive short film known as Infinite Jest. It's the same title of the book. So maybe that's another reason why they titled the book Infinite Jest, because it ties directly into the worldview of Infinite Jest. But the movie Infinite Jest, made by Hal and Mario and Oren's father, is said to be so addictive that it destroys your life and you just die in front of the television or the cartridge player, the TP, I guess you could say. They call it telecomputers. Or is that 1984? I can't remember. But anyway, I think they're telecomputers or something that project these cartridges, and you die watching Infinite Jest. And that's kind of oddly not oddly fascinating, but just fascinating in general, because maybe the overall goal is for Infinite Jest's readers to die reading Infinite Jest because it's so complicated and so entertaining. And I do have some critiques of Infinite Jest. It's not without critiques, but we'll get to that at the end. But is this secret film made by James Incandenza, Infinite Jest, is that sort of a stand-in for the book itself, Infinite Jest, and the readers are the ones we're kind of the brunt of the joke, perhaps, maybe. So for whatever reason, it's not made exactly clear, but Hugh Steepley, the cross-dressing secret agent, Quebec French-Canadian agent, is what was I going to say about him? He's very focused on sort of free speech and sort of the right to make your own decisions personally and also geopolitically. But he doesn't really have this huge, tremendous character arc. Really, maybe we missed it, but I just didn't really quite get it. But why exactly he's the one hired to spy on Oren, and why Oren develops an infatuation with him, that would take a rereading, maybe a further study. But it's not exactly explained why he's the one that's hired to, or why he's the one that wants to get a hold of the secret entertainment, as it's called, aka the film Infinite Jest. So the title Infinite Jest is the novel's title, but also functions as and we talked about the entertainment cartridge. I don't want to repeat myself there, so I'm going to skip to the next page here. But you sort of see where we're going. We've got a really complex, multifaceted plot with sort of this huge focus on geopolitical espionage / conspiracy. Now, the mystery, like we said, remains of what exactly takes place on or during the short film Infinite Jest. It's never explained to my knowledge. If anybody can recommend any articles in the comment section below, please do that. I would be interested to, find out. What exactly is it? Is it some kind of extreme, I don't even know, like snuff movie or like what exactly is so entertaining about the film Infinite Jest? Or is the film cartridge Infinite Jest made by James Incandenza, is it secretly the narrative of Infinite Jest? Maybe the movie Infinite Jest in the book is basically the movie about Infinite Jest, if that makes sense. Maybe the book is the movie and vice versa. Maybe that's not quite spot on. But the fascinating, never-ending labyrinth of Infinite Jest raises the question of, I think we'll kind of start bringing up this topic here. Infinite Jest in itself, not only the book and the narrative, but also its reputation sort of brings up the idea of, is Infinite Jest even worth reading because of its complexity? And like I said in the beginning, I think it's worth reading. I think it's a great novel. I think it has a lot of really good, interesting explorations and parallels to addiction and family trauma and all kinds of psychological, philosophical themes. But the novel being so bafflingly complex and convoluted with innumerable answers and rabbit holes that ultimately oftentimes lead nowhere, from what my research has sort of suggested, or at best just leads you back in sort of another looping circle, bringing the reader around this sort of cyclical narrative. Why keep trying to reread and read and decipher this indecipherable, complicated, convoluted text? And I think that's kind of like the sportsmanship of Infinite Jest, sort of like, Benjamin McVoy was even talking about the fact that the end notes sort of function as sort of this reference to playing tennis. Yeah, when you're going back and forth between the narrative and the end notes. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a thing, but maybe just the whole competitive aspect of understanding Infinite Jest is part of David Foster Wallace, or his celebration of tennis and sportsmanship in general. He's obviously trying to get one up on the readers, but he also wants the readers to bring their full attention to it. So what is sort of the purpose of the end goal to reading Infinite Jest? Is it is it to learn about addiction and family trauma and recovery, and to see ourselves mirrored in David Foster Wallace's characters? And this is really interesting here, or do Infinite Jest's readers sort of read it on its reputation alone and just sort of looking to take up a good challenge, and also just to sort of say that we've read it and sort of engage and have discourse with the Infinite Jest sort of aficionados that claim that Infinite Jest is the best thing in the world? I think that's kind of what we talked about between the division of the consensus or the reputation surrounding Infinite Jest, is that it's either worshipped and it's the best novel ever, or it's the people on the other side sort of speculate that Infinite Jest is just sort of this stuffy, what's the word I'm looking for, pretentious sort of nerding out of people that are like a good challenge. I read this one article saying that Infinite Jest readers are young males that want to be impressed, and I don't think it's as simple as that. I mean, Infinite Jest has a lot of different readers, women readers included, and we'll talk about some of the criticism of David Foster Wallace. He had quite a few feminist critics, but so that sort of leaves the question: what's the purpose of reading Infinite Jest? Is it to get something out of it about addiction or family trauma, or does it cater to people that just really enjoy dystopian literature? Or do we just read Infinite Jest based on its reputation? I mean, I can't help but deny that the only reason I picked up Infinite Jest was because I heard other, writers and YouTubers talking about it. And I didn't just read it because I wanted to just read it for the sake of it, but I wanted to see what the hype was. Yeah, if that makes sense. So I think, when you see a book this big and you start reading about some of the controversies behind David Foster Wallace, you hear it's this big postmodern tome, and it's complicated, it's convoluted. That kind of it dissuades you from reading it, but on another level, it inspires you to read it because you kind of want to. Not that you want to be on that in crowd of Infinite Jest aficionados, but you want to, you want to sort of embark on this sort of secret mission, if you will, that you've been left out on. You want to find out what Infinite Jest is all about. Kind of similar to why somebody would maybe pick up War and Peace or Anna Karenina or East of Eden, because you want to be on the in crowd of the literary elites, right? But you also want to experience the power and the beauty of the literature too. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to pick up Infinite Jest or any other book based on reputation alone. People might do that with Charles Bukowski too, for example. Charles Bukowski is this huge drunken misogynist. They want to see what's so controversial about him. So we did talk about how Infinite Jest is sort of this huge runaround of sort of this pseudo-intellectual runaround that leads nowhere in terms of plot, character development, and interchanging convoluted narratives, but it does offer something in reward in terms of its philosophical and social commentary on addiction, family trauma, geopolitics, etc. So we sort of touched upon that. So I wanted to make sure that we sort of contextualize that the fact that Infinite Jest is sort of a dystopian geopolitical challenge, but at its basic qualities, Infinite Jest is more about the character arcs, and I think that's why people keep reading Infinite Jest, is because of those really fascinating characters. Don Gately and Hal and Condenza and Oren and James and Steepley and all these weird characters, and you can't quite figure out why they're related or how they're related, but if you keep reading it, yes, you'll find out that they all play sort of a crucial role influencing each other, if not in their daily life, in their long-term sort of destiny. So I think that's important to mention. Now, I think sort of that last topic that I discussed sort of begs the question of Infinite Jest's literary merits. Are Infinite Jest readers just sort of these literary savants that, love a good mystery, or does the novel actually contribute a major discussion on a sort of a societal, philosophical level regarding trauma, addiction? And we sort of touched upon that a couple of minutes ago. But yes, I would say that Infinite Jest is worth reading because of its highly realistic, in most cases, but highly nuanced exploration of addiction, family trauma, and you find yourself relating to these characters quite well. And that's kind of what most of these endnotes are, or most of what these sticky notes are. We got endnotes, footnotes, sticky notes. Forgive me, but these, and I sort of found myself creating my own endnotes, and that's kind of what these functioned as in Infinite Jest. We haven't even gotten to the whole controversy of David Foster Wallace's endnotes. But reading Infinite Jest I definitely recommend. You don't have to make your own footnotes or endnotes, but keep your own sticky notes. Maybe journal about it. I like to make sticky notes because it contextualizes something in a short period of time in a nice little summary, versus when you start journaling, you just go off onto all these little tangents. A little bit more about the plot of Infinite Jest. There are subtle but pretty bold Shakespearean themes referencing Hamlet. Obviously, alas, poor Yorick, he was a man of infinite jest, blah, blah, blah. But it's more complicated than that. We'll talk a little bit about that. There's a focus on psychoanalysis through regression, almost as a form of therapy itself. And we get that with Hal, and especially with Don Gately towards the end, when he's sort of reminiscing on his past, and all these other characters with terrible trauma come up. And that's also what's interesting about David Foster Wallace, and he says this in many interviews, is that literature sort of gave him, or gives authors, a platform to discuss things that we sure as heck would not feel comfortable talking about at the dinner table or even during a really intense interview. And I think David Foster Wallace does a great job, of a beautiful job, in fact, of exploring these highly repressed memories, these highly repressed traumatic events through many of these characters. But there's a little bit of a sort of a Shakespearean thing that ties in with Hamlet, obviously, and Hal, and sort of the Freudian tensions with the mother, and James, dies very much similar to the father, and Hamlet dies, and then both the mothers get remarried, both Hamlet's mother and obviously Hal and Cadenza's mother. So there's obviously it's rumored to be sort of a modern dystopian retelling of Hamlet, and then towards the end we have Oren and another character. We'll get to it later, but they actually go to retrieve. And they dig up the head of James and Cadenza because they're trying to find the entertainment cartridge, Infinite Jest. They don't find it for some reason. There's this whole other section of the novel that I think is worth mentioning surrounding Hal and Cadenza, where he goes to this, I think what he thinks is like an AA recovery meeting or something, but the whole meeting ends up being these sort of grown adult men that are sort of confronting their issues with the inner child, the inner infant, the mother-son dynamic. And we have people in the crowd shouting, honor the infant. And that was a really fascinating retrospective in the novel, I think, that sort of really alludes to David Foster Wallace himself's sort of psychosexual infantile trauma or repressed memories. And Harold Bloom, liked to talk about how Thomas Wolfe's was sort of like the eternal adolescent, and his readers are, the eternal adolescent, because Thomas Wolfe could never, get out of his sort of adolescent trauma. But I think, in fact, David Foster Wallace is like the eternal adolescent in my book, much more so than Thomas Wolfe. But we can sort of see how writers all the way from Thomas Wolfe, even to Ernest Hemingway, to David Foster Wallace, are sort of exploring some of the same themes of repressed, highly repressed, repressed through addiction and social pressures and all kinds of stuff. But this idea of trying to seek some kind of therapy or some kind of release from this overarching and extremely painful, overwhelming sort of never-ending adolescent conversation that takes place, that we're almost sort of trying to achieve this rapture through regression, or this epiphany, this heaven through regressing back to an earlier age, not only for the sake of escaping our problems in the modern times as adults, but sort of to uncover the issues of why we're so messed up in the first place through this highly addictive form of sort of regression and all this sort of therapeutic stuff that comes up. So it's a fascinating exploration, obviously not only addiction, but also trauma. And I think we've kind of covered most of that. But obviously Hal struggles existentially, as well as a complicated dynamic with his mother, Avril. And that obviously is very Hamlet-esque. So sort of getting towards the tail end of this lecture here, reading and finishing Infinite Jest obviously is an accomplishment. Pat yourselves on the back. I'll give myself 2 pats on the back. But just because you read Infinite Jest, that doesn't mean that your passion or your study or your reading of David Foster Wallace stops there. No, in fact, once you complete Infinite Jest, that's really where the real work begins to really understand David Foster Wallace. And that's why we're going back to Girl with Curious Hair and his older novels and his other short stories, essays, because I think, and we'll talk about this now, or maybe we'll talk about that later, but sort of, Infinite Jest can sort of fall into people reading it based on its reputation alone, and it sort of becomes like this bucket list book, and people read it or they struggle through it, and either they're fascinated to read it again like I would be, or they're like, glad that's over, let's put it back on the shelf. And David Foster Wallace sort of kind of falls into the background and they don't care about him anymore. So you definitely don't want to be in that camp. If you're going to read Infinite Jest, you should read it to open up the floodgates of the David Foster Wallace universe. So Skipping to, let's talk a little bit about the endnotes here. The infamous endnotes, some of which run to 5, 6, 7, 10 pages sometimes. There's about, I would say, I don't know, a little over 100 pages of endnotes. What was the purpose of them? David Foster Wallace claims that it was like a second voice in his head, right? That sort of let him explain certain things, let him clarify things. We also have the sort of the Benjamin McVoy idea that it was sort of this sort of reference to playing tennis, this back and forth interaction that made the reader sort of engage a little bit more with the novel. But unfortunately, to me personally, as a reader, I found the endnotes to be very highly distracting. I think they would have functioned better as footnotes so that you didn't have to have like two different bookmarks in your book to flip back and forth between the endnotes. And I also found the endnotes to not really be all that helpful or instructive to the overall, character arcs or the overall themes. I thought most of them were kind of just petty. Most of them were just explaining obscure drugs that most people have never heard of. Occasionally, there was some sort of family anecdote that was maybe important, but they were so rambly and so convoluted that I found myself oftentimes not even exploring the endnotes, not even reading them. There are some important ones like the whole film retrospective of all the films that Mario Incandenza makes, and sort of the stuff about James Incandenza's unliving. And some of the stuff about Hugh Steepley and Mimi Moranth and Joel Van Dyne. Some of those endnotes were interesting, but I found the endnotes to be highly, highly distractive, and I think they could have functioned much better if David Foster Wallace wasn't trying to clarify every little single thing. Now, the endnotes aren't constant, but they're fairly prevalent. And I actually think it's a brilliant idea to have endnotes, and maybe David Foster Wallace was maybe one of the first authors to do that in sort of the novel form. And it's actually inspired me to have footnotes or maybe endnotes in mine, but I'm going to be much more selective with mine so that when I do have an endnote, it's completely necessary. It's actually means something versus just, just having endnotes just for the sake so David Foster Wallace could kind of ramble about all this random stuff. I did not find that particularly helpful in that sense. So let's go a little bit further towards the tail end of this video. Who was David Foster Wallace? And that's kind of a loaded question. But allegations against Wallace obviously range from sexism, racism, homophobia, even transphobia. Yet Wallace continues to curate or sort of, he still has this burgeoning, ever-growing reader base among all kinds of people. So in some of the controversies, the sort of the bad press, the controversies, the feminist critics, the gay critics of David Foster Wallace sort of later stood corrected. I read some stuff on the internet how some of his fans actually questioned him about some of the ways that he portrayed, Hugh Steepley, for example, kind of portrayed him as this very highly unattractive, sort of trans, sort of this trans joke, perhaps. And people thought that David Foster Wallace was making fun of trans people or making fun of gay people. And yes, a lot of that was allegedly a product of its time, but that could be a product of anybody's time. And I think maybe David Foster Wallace was trying to explore something that he didn't quite understand, kind of like Thomas Wolfe does with sort of the African American and Jewish characters in his novels. He didn't quite understand them, but he interacted with them. He wanted to understand them, but unfortunately, sometimes it came out as sort of like he was mocking them. I think that's similar to David Foster Wallace. But most of what I've read about fans that have met David Foster Wallace, unfortunately, David Foster Wallace is no longer with us. We'll talk more about that later. But most of his fans, David Foster Wallace was able to clear that up, or at least partly justify the fact that, once he moved out of some of the other places that he was living, once he taught in California, he met more people from diverse backgrounds and really began to sort of understand them. Obviously, we can't discuss the universe of David Foster Wallace without briefly getting into sort of the, Mary Carr allegations. I'm not gonna. Maybe we'll go back and make a video about that later on. There's some other YouTubers that you can watch to sort of contextualize that. But yes, he had a sort of a history of very irrational, oftentimes violent, highly charged relationship with Mary Carr, maybe some of his other girlfriends. He slept with his students, oftentimes, allegedly exploited his students, so on and so forth. Hell, Harold Bloom even did that too. But, you know, later on, he ends up marrying this woman named Karen Green, who was like a visual artist and had a very successful, loving relationship with her up until the time that he unlived himself. So there's sort of two. I don't think that, like we said, when you read David Foster Wallace, whether it's Infinite Jest or The Pale King or Girl with Curious Hair or Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, you're going to get a lot of sort of contradictory. My lip's bleeding. This video has been so epic that now my lip is bleeding. You get a lot of multifaceted complexities. There's many complexities, both mentally and emotionally and spiritually, with David Foster Wallace, and I think that that's partly what makes him sort of attractive as an author and as a person, is because he's interesting because he's flawed, right? But I'm not going to get too far into his personal life, domestically. I mean, that's kind of his business. Going a little bit further, Wallace's obsession with suicide, drugs, and trauma oftentimes leaves me wondering what really happened to David Foster Wallace to drive him to such neurotic and hyper-analytical lengths in his writing. What was kind of wrong with this guy, I think, is kind of the question. What sort of abuse did he endure? What sort of mistreatment did he endure? Moreover, Wallace's perceived worldview and reputation unfairly stand on Infinite Jest. And I think we talked about that a little bit, before. His reputation stands unfairly on Infinite Jest, which I think is unfair because he's got so many other works of essays and even some poetry and shorter novels. But perhaps some of the mysteries and controversies surrounding David Foster Wallace that we don't get from Infinite Jest, or that we are wondering about regarding Infinite Jest, perhaps his other works can help to sort of clarify or clear up some of those mysteries, if you will. So a little bit more about David Foster Wallace. Comes from an elite academic family, vast and intricate knowledge of geopolitics, which to me is a little bit suspicious. How did he know so much about geopolitics unless maybe he was instructed or taught or connected in some way by some form of intelligence? We talked about that with Bukowski too, or at best maybe somebody pitched him this idea, somebody in the geopolitical intelligence sector sort of pitch some of these ideas to him in order to influence society. I think that's definitely a possibility. It's very reminiscent of a lot of celebrities, these strange unlivings that have to do with ropes, and it's a little sketchy. Obviously, the dystopian world building is a little bit suspicious. We talked about some of the conspiracies that I suspect with George Orwell, for example. So was David Foster Wallace connected or had some kind of intelligence knowledge? I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. Also, several mentions of cults, CIA, mind control, government oppression. So these are themes that David Foster Wallace was either interested in or either had high, sort of high depth intellectual knowledge about. So you can kind of make of that what you will. David Foster Wallace, unfortunately, like we said, suffered from severe depression most of his life, with several unliving attempts. Electroshock therapy, antidepressants. Never get on antidepressants, folks. It's never good. Unfortunately, to conclude this video, he was unable to defeat his demons and ended up unliving himself in 2008. But what a fantastic legacy! What a fantastic book! What a great myriad of engaging, retrospective, fascinating questions that come up with Infinite Jest. Let me know if you think we're onto something. Was David Foster Wallace, far more complicated and well-connected character than we can even imagine, or was he just really brilliant and that's how we came up with all this stuff? What was sort of the abuse that he suffered from his mother? Why was he so not very vocal about his relationship with his father. There are some happy memories that he had. I think he had a sister, maybe one other brother or something. But from the get-go, especially once he embarks on his academic career, David Foster Wallace really suffered mentally, spiritually, and oftentimes physically. Obviously, with the addiction, a lot of self-doubt. He's really, really struggled to write The Pale King. And by the time we get to The Pale King, as a result of Infinite Jest, I think he wanted to sort of go in a different direction, is what's sort of alleged. But not only was he blocked sort of creatively and spiritually, but he was also blocked creatively and spiritually by antidepressants, or trying to get off antidepressants and then not being able to handle it. Electroshock therapy, I mean, that goes all the way back to Ernest Hemingway times. So why are these highly gifted people getting electric shock therapy? It just reminds me of like something way back in the CIA mind control days, where people would get who was forcing David Foster Wallace to get electroshock therapy? And like I said, we have a lot of different types of content surrounding David Foster Wallace, but I think I've brought some questions to the table that no other YouTubers have really been talking about. Who is he connected to? Why was he possibly ritualistically abused by somebody? Was he abused by academia? Was he abused by his odd relationship with his mother? Who was his father? Why did he write Infinite Jest? Why was he considered the greatest writer of our generation? Did he have some kind of vast connection or knowledge of geopolitics that was never really explained? Were there maybe politicians or lobbyists in his pocket trying to get him to influence sort of this counterculture? And I think even Right Conscious was talking about how oftentimes what we see about David Foster Wallace may even be kind of a persona, like this oftentimes sort of frazzle-brained, sometimes inarticulate, stressed out, sweating, sort of neurotic academic guy that's really sensitive. Maybe that was more of like a just something sort of a persona, right, to sort of make him more relatable to the audience or to his readers. So I think that's a very interesting sort of thing that Ian mentioned from Right Conscious. But as far as all the other sort of connections that he may or may not have had, I don't think anybody's really discussed that. So hopefully you guys got something out of this. Hopefully that inspires you to read Infinite Jest. We only kind of touched the surface in terms of the plot, the themes, the character arcs, but we covered a decent amount of material in this nearly 50-minute video. So I hope you guys will, study this video, maybe take some notes, but also be encouraged to really read Infinite Jest, because that's really where the whole magic of David Foster Wallace occurs. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily his best work, because I haven't really read any of his other work, but I would say that it's definitely worth it. It's engaging, it's fun, it's tragic, but it's also educational and morally instructive. And I think that's what David Foster Wallace was getting at. He always said that literature can be really intense and really highbrow and sort of spiritually, morally uplifting, but it's also supposed to be fun. But he also claimed in several interviews that he didn't understand why people thought Infinite Jest was so funny. Was that sort of part of his persona, that he didn't understand any of the humor in Infinite Jest? Or was he just so immersed in his own trauma and his own depression that he sort of used humor / irony to sort of take some of that pressure off? So that's an interesting topic as well. Thank you so much for watching this video, and make sure you guys like this video, share it with your literary friends. Let me know down in the comment section below what everybody's been up to lately as far as reading wise. Let me know how your writing is coming along. Please check out the author analysis / review playlist that we have curated for y'all. Check out some of the recent book hauls. Check out all the playlists that we got here on In-Depth Literature, and we will see everybody in the next one. Thank you so much.